Welcome. Thank you for your patience. I'm Patricia Rosenmeyer. I'm the the faculty director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Kaplan Brauer Lecture in Jewish Studies with Marat Grinberg of Reed College. The center's Kaplan Brauer Lectureship is dedicated to the memory of Jenny and Reuben Kaplan and Hilde and Alfred Brauer, who were parents of the donors. Both the Kaplans and the Brauers were immigrants to the United States, the Kaplans escaping the Russian pogroms and the Brauers escaping the Holocaust in Germany. In addition, the donors honor the memory of their brother, Albert S. Kaplan, who was disabled while fighting with the American Army in the Philippines during World War II. All of us at the center are very thankful for this endowed lectureship, which was created in the summer of 2003, just a few months after the center was established. I'd also like to thank the different units that have co-sponsored: the Carolina Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and German and Slavic Languages and Literatures. I also want to thank all of you for coming out in a very difficult time. And my hope is that it will be an intellectual distraction for us as we get through the week. Just before we introduce our speaker, I want to take a minute to make sure you all know about our upcoming November 13th lecture called Confronting Authority in Pursuit of Justice, Lay People's Voices in Talmudic Jewish Courts. And of course, on our website, we have lots of other interesting lectures, and I hope you can join us. As usual, all of this is made possible through generous gifts to the center. Everything we do here is because of the support of alumni and friends, and you can always find out more at jewishstudies.unc.edu. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Michelle Rifkin-Fish, who's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, and she will actually do the real introduction for tonight's speaker. Thank you. Both are real introductions. I am really delighted to introduce Professor Marat Grinberg from the Department of Russian at Reed College. Professor Grinberg is a prolific scholar of Soviet-era Russian language Jewish literature, Yiddish literature and film, and even American Jewish culture. He studies poetry, science fiction, and representations of the Holocaust, among other topics. His first book, which is called I Am to be Read Not Left to Right, but in Jewish, From Right to Left, The Poetics of Boris Slutsky, was published in 2011. Slutsky was one of the major Soviet poets from the so-called generation of 1940, and the only Soviet poet who focused on the Holocaust in his work. Professor Grinberg's second book examines the film called Komissar by Alexander Askoldov, which was based on a short story written by the Jewish writer Vasily Grossman about a traditional Jewish family during the Civil War of the early 1920s and the female Soviet military leader who comes into their lives. Professor Grinberg has also written about the Jewish themes in Woody Allen's work, about a Yiddish language film based on Sholem Aleichem's character Tevye, made in New York in 1939, and more. Today, Professor Grinberg will be speaking about his newest book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, Jewish Culture and Identity Between the Lines, which came out earlier this year. I personally have been waiting for this book for over 30 years, and I'd like to share briefly with you why it is so important. When Soviet Jews gained the opportunity to freely emigrate from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they encountered a long-standing stereotype in both the American Jewish community and Israeli Jewish society, that they so-called knew nothing about Judaism and had lost all connection with Jewish identity. Efforts got underway both here and in Israel to teach them what it meant to be Jewish, without exploring what Jewish identity meant for them. The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, and you can see here, offers a fascinating account of the historical and cultural substance of Soviet Jewish identity. It offers rich insights into how Soviet Jewish writers expressed and created their sense of Jewish identity, and how Soviet Jewish readers discerned their messages, which were often coded.
It offers an inspiring analysis of how people maintained and developed their identity under conditions of censorship and repression. Beyond teaching us about Soviet Jewish experience, this book has a lot to teach American Jews about fascinating ways of approaching Jewish history and culture more generally. So please join me in welcoming Marat Grinberg to UNC.
Can everybody hear me? Thank you, Michelle, for such a generous introduction and your personal story about Soviet Jewish experience and what that all means. And I'm thrilled to be here. I was here, I think, 6 or 7 years ago, giving a talk about my other book on the film Commissar. So it's wonderful to be back, and I'm grateful to the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies for bringing me here, and to the Department of German and Slavic Studies. I'm also grateful to all of you for being here. It is obviously a very difficult moment in Jewish history, in the world, and I think we're still all reeling from the pain that took place in Israel. But I think, as you'll see, the experience of Soviet Jews and what the Soviet Jewish, I would say, civilization meant is certainly linked to what is happening in Israel. Just keeping in mind that I think, according to statistics, every fourth person on the Israeli streets is comes from the former Soviet Union. So I think I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I hope to have many questions. Okay, so this is related, I think, to what Michelle was talking about. And I'd like to begin with these 3 images that speak to how Soviet Jewish experience has been generally understood in the West, and in some sense continues to be understood, right? And I think many of you will be familiar with these images and what they stand for. The first one, "Let my people go," is, of course, the efforts of American Jewish community to force the Soviet Union to release Soviet Jews and allow them to come to the West, be it to Israel or be it to the United States. Right? It uses this biblical language, "Shlach et ami," right? Let my people go, and then very much presents Soviet Jews as victims of the Soviet regime, right? The brethren who need to be helped, and so when they come to the West, they can rejoin the Jewish community and start being a real Jews. Yeah, students struggle for Soviet Jewry. Yeah. The second image, again, I think familiar to all of you, comes, of course, from Fiddler on the Roof and Topol, who just passed away just recently. And the image, and I think that in the mind of, in the popular American Jewish imagination, Soviet Jewry is still very much linked to the old country, right? And the idea of tradition, and Anatevka, and all of that stuff. So that, in fact, is the image of the Soviet Jew. Of course, the shock that American Jews experience, or Israelis experience for that matter, is when actually, an influx of Soviet Jews, and they see that there is definitely a disconnect, that those who are coming hardly resemble the Tevye from Anatevka. Yeah, and then finally, sort of the real intellectual piece of this perception of Soviet Jews is a book by Elie Wiesel, right? The name that is familiar to all of you. Wiesel goes to the Soviet Union in 1966 and writes this book, The Jews of Silence, yeah, where he depicts the Soviet Jewish community, the Soviet Jews, as Jews of silence. In other words, they're unable to practice Judaism, and he very much depicts them as these Jews who are yearning for piety, right, and who are yearning to be able to rejoin the Jewish community and rejoin Judaism, but they've been silenced. And then, interestingly, Wiesel turns that around and he says, well, who are the real Jews of silence? The real Jews of silence are the American Jews, because you American Jews are doing nothing to help the Soviet Jews get out of from the Soviet Union. And that, of course, leads to our first image, the struggle by the American Jews to to force the Soviet Union to release Soviet Jews. Yeah. And so these three images, I think, kind of comprise this perception of what the Soviet Jewish experience is all about and what Soviet Jewish history stands for, right? It is about victimhood. Yeah, it is about, again, yearning for piety, and it is about the old world. Yeah. And so what I did in my book, yeah, in my book, The Soviet Jewish Bookshelf, I decided to confront this myth head on, yeah, and try to understand what Soviet Jewish intellectual world, particularly after the Holocaust, consisted of, but even more than that, right? What is it about the Soviet Jewish experience that made it so interesting, unique, and rich? As I write in my book, and I'll just quote a little bit. The fascinating phenomenon that was Soviet Jewish consciousness consisted of far more than the remains of Yiddishkeit, linguistic, culinary, and religious on the one hand, and total Russification or Sovietization on the other. Soviet Jewish culture was also in profound ways a post-Holocaust phenomenon that went far beyond local cases of Jewish worship and remembrance of the war atrocities. Less familiar than and distinct from the Jewish cultures and identities that emerged in the state of Israel and the United States, yet undeniably linked to them, it constitutes a captivating and vital topic of inquiry. The question of culture is key here, and this is where I'll get to why I think that the idea of the bookshelf is so important. The question of culture is key here. That is how Jewishly thin or thick Soviet Jewish culture was. If in the thick category, and I'm quoting, knowledge of ethno-religious tradition and culture is central, in the thin one, the identity is much more essentialized and nominal, and hence, as suggested by pioneer historian of Soviet Jewry Zvi Gittelman, perhaps not, I quote, sufficiently substantive and sustainable to preserve a group's distinctiveness on more than a symbolic level, right? So again, these two ideas, thick culture, that is, there is knowledge, there's a real substance, and thin, there's sort of an intuitive understanding of your difference, of your identity, but it's not rooted in anything substantial or knowledge-wise. Yeah. My argument is that Soviet Jewish culture after the Holocaust, after Stalin's death, although the roots of that reach before that, yeah, was in fact a thick culture. Fragmentary, yes, but thick nevertheless, right? And so if we really cannot speak about tradition as the basis of that, because a great majority of Soviet Jews were deeply secular, having grown up in a militant atheist state, we can really not talk about language, since a great majority of Soviet Jews after the Holocaust spoke Russian as their first language. Yeah, we also can speak about material culture only to a limited extent. Yeah, so what is it then that allows me to argue that Soviet Jewish culture was indeed thin? I'm sorry, thick. Yes? What constituted it then? Unless we, as students, chroniclers, and interpreters of Soviet Jewishness, answer this question and arrive at an understanding of what comprised the knowledge base of Soviet Jews across the board and how this knowledge was transmitted through historical periods and generations, the thickness of Soviet Jewish identity would remain a debatable proposition at best. The historian Olga Litvak sees it as precisely that, writing, and I'm quoting, "There is no there. Russian Jews broke their ties to Judaism when they became Soviet citizens. The Jewishness of Soviet Jews was radically stripped of Jewish content. Cut off from access to Jewish knowledge, it could generate none," according to Olga Litvak. I am arguing the reading practices of Soviet Jews hold the key to the sources of Jewish knowledge that fed their identity. For again, to quote Litvak, context is everything. To uncover this context and fill in the existing lacuna, I reconstruct post-Holocaust Soviet Jewish identity and culture in my book through the concept of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf as the basis of Soviet Jews' improbably defiant and necessarily makeshift Jewish heritage and knowledge. In an atmosphere where Judaism was all but destroyed In the very public presence of the Jew delegitimized, Jewish memory and identity continued to exist and develop through subversive and implicit reading practices underpinned by fractured memories and half-whispered conversations. Soviet Jewishness was not an empty sign or only one of victimhood, as has been previously thought, but filled with meanings, historical, experiential, cultural, and ethnic, all connected to the books Soviet Jews read. And so why the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, right? To get at that meaning, I think the idea of the bookshelf is crucial, yeah? So here you see me, probably at the age of 12, 13, and behind me you see something that is familiar to anybody who grew up in the Soviet Union or studies Soviet culture, Soviet society, and that's the bookcase, right? The centerpiece of Soviet apartments, which of course would be the centerpiece of the apartments where intelligentsia lived, but also much more kind of widespread and across the board. Yeah. So what does Jewishness mean in Soviet context is a question that I ask. And as I said, it's not religious. Yeah. Language is also not the venue that we can really take, although it's more complicated as we'll see. And it's not material culture. But at the same time, post-Holocaust Soviet Jews had a very distinct understanding of their difference, which was not just intuitive, but which was filled with meanings. Yeah. And to recreate the realities of Soviet Jewish culture, we have to go back to the books that Soviet Jews read, the books that they privileged, right? And think about the ways that they read those books. In other words, what I'm arguing is that many of the books that one would see in Soviet Jewish homes and Soviet Jewish apartments would also be found in non-Jewish homes. Yeah, but the way that Soviet Jews approached them was distinctly different. What they emphasized was distinctly different, right? We can talk also in the Q&A session, hopefully, how I get it, how I can make that argument, right? And how we can arrive at that global understanding, which is very, very difficult, but I think we can arrive at it nonetheless, right? I'm also emphasizing the importance of both parts of the equation, Soviet Jewish. In other words, the Soviet is a very important component, right? It is not just there, if we go back to Wiesel, only because of totalitarianism, only because of censorship. No, right? We're talking about people who grew up in the Soviet Union, very much felt a part of it and participated in the life of that country, yeah? And tried to negotiate between all these different components, Soviet, Jewish, and other ones, yeah, Russian, Ukrainian, etc., yeah. And as I said, I'm very much debating with the idea of seeing Soviet Jews as Jews of silence. And so juxtapositions and intersections of context is so important here. Here, as I'll try to go through the sort of the content of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf and the different layers, you'll see how these different contexts, literary, historical, political, intersect within that bookcase, right? Speaking also to different periods within Soviet history. The books that were privileged in the 1950s would be different than the books that were privileged in the 1960s or the 1970s, although at the same time, there is a canon that we can speak of, right? There are books that run through all of these, through all of these epochs. And why is this important today? Well, I think it's important because, remember, Soviet Jews constituted the third largest community of world Jewry for the good chunk of the 20th century, after the American Jewish community and Israel. Former Soviet Jewish actors are also on the world stage. If you think about Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who's just a year younger than me and very much grew up in a household that is quite similar to the household that I grew up in. And I give you 99% that the books, or many of the books that I'm discussing in my book, were also on his parents' bookshelf, and probably are still there. What he did with them is another story, of course, keeping in mind that he is a politician. Or if you think about somebody like Avigdor Lieberman, or other prominent former Soviet Jews who are who are front and center. And again, I think keep it in mind what is happening today, right? Soviet Jews is sort of that link between the American Jewish community, Israel, right, and that past. So understanding them and what made them tick intellectually, culturally is very, very important, I think, for understanding the moment that we're in. Okay, so this is the bookshelf that I put together as I was writing my book and kind of reconstructing the Soviet Jewish bookshelf and putting together these books. And as I said previously, on the one hand, material culture is not sufficient, right, to sort of answer the question of what Soviet Jewishness was all about. At the same time, books are both part of an intellectual history, are both part of the kind of cultural atmosphere, but they're also part of material culture, right? Because books are objects, right? Soviet books have a distinct smell, right? So with me, and I'm sure that's true of so many others, it works like a Proustian Madeleine, right? You can open up a book, you just get the whiff, and it brings up so many memories, some good, some not so good, yeah? And so that's where the bookshelf, I think, is just so important because it's tangible. And also keeping in mind that so many of these books would end up in the United States, in Israel, in Germany, wherever Soviet Jews left. And thinking about the war in Ukraine, there are so many stories about those who left, the refugees from Ukraine, or the Russians fleeing from Russia and taking their books with them, right? And again, we have these suitcases filled with books, although today there's also electronic options, which makes it a little bit easier. So the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, I'll give you a little bit of kind of sort of my theoretical approach and my methodology. So I view the Soviet Jewish bookshelf as a geological bed, right? And I borrow this idea from Osip Mandelstam, as we say in Judaism, lehavdil. I'm not comparing myself to Mandelstam, but the idea of the bookcase that Mandelstam presents in his autobiography, The Noise of Time, Shum Vremeni, published in 1925, is where I derive this idea from. And so let's look at this passage that is familiar to many of you, probably. Mandelstam says, the bookcase of early childhood is a man's companion for life. The arrangement of its shelves, the choice of books, the colors of the spines are for him the color, height, and arrangement of world literature itself. And as for books which were not included in the first bookcase, they were never to force their way into the universal world literature. Every book in the first bookcase is willy-nilly a classic, and not one of them can ever be expelled. There was nothing haphazard in the way that strange little library had been deposited, like a geological bed over several decades. The paternal and maternal elements in it were not mixed, but existed separately, and a cross-section of the strata showed the history of the spiritual efforts of the entire family, as well as the inoculation of it with alien blood, right? And then Mandelstam goes on to famously talk about the different layers within that bookcase, but the Judaic chaos on the bottom, and then as you go up, you come to the classics, the German classics, the Russian classics, right? And he says, for raznachinец, sort of for member of intelligentsia, this is where you derive your identity from, right? This is where you derive your sense of history from, right? Which shows that the idea of the bookcase is so central to modernist Jewish experience in general, to Russian Jewish literary history in general. And I think it really works in the Soviet Jewish case because, again, what I try to do with this idea of the bookcase is to see it as that geological bed and to try to reconstruct it, right? To kind of undertake this archaeological investigation, which in many cases, I have to say, was also an investigation of my own personal family history. Yeah, there are other, for the sake of time, we're not going to stop here, but there are other examples that I discuss which show the centrality of the bookcase, again, to modern and modernist Jewish experience. Here is Chaim Nachman Bialik, great modernist Hebrew poet, and the lines from his poem Before the Book Closet, right, where he returns to the to his house, to his home, and confronts the books, the sacred Jewish volumes that he's left behind. And there is a disparity, right? He can understand them, and he's asking, is it because I don't have the key to your language anymore, or because you don't really have much substance to begin with, right? And it leads kind of to his tragedy. Yeah. Another piece of sort of my methodological thinking is writing and reading between the lines. Yeah. As you'll see, some of the books that I discussed certainly were explicitly Jewish, right? But many, many books needed to be read between the lines, which of course is not accidental, since we're discussing a deeply authoritarian society, and how they were read, how that functions would vary from epoch to epoch. And I take this idea from Leo Strauss and his almost canonical essay, Persecution and the Art of Writing, which he writes and publishes for the first time significantly in 1941, when he's already in the United States, right? And here Strauss talks about that in authoritarian societies, he's thinking about the classical world, right? But also really thinking about Nazi Germany. But in authoritarian society, the writers developed a certain technique of writing between the lines, where on top you have the exoteric layer, meaning that is accessible to all, and beneath you have esoteric layer that is accessible only to the select few. So writing between the lines generates reading between the lines, right? And so what I show is that very often between writers and readers, or writers as readers, there developed this dialogue, right? Where the key was looking for that meaning that is there. Why hidden there? Why I think Strauss really works in the Soviet Jewish case is because, as Strauss says, it is impossible to access the esoteric meaning, the hidden meaning, without first understanding what is accessible, what is on top. In other words, what is allowed by the censor. Yeah, those exist in a very intricate dialogue, which also goes against something that in this idea of Jews of silence, and that it's all just kind of to please the censorship. So what are the layers, right? Going back to geological bed, what are the layers within the Soviet Jewish bookshelf as we excavated? Of course, translations from German, which were incredibly significant, as I'll talk about in just a minute. Translations from Yiddish, of which were in so many translations from Yiddish, the Yiddish classics, but also contemporary Yiddish literature that begins to develop and exist from the mid-1950s, right? Stalin essentially destroys all of Soviet Yiddish literature in the last years of his rule. During the thaw, during the 1950s, Yiddish literature is allowed to develop again, and there are so many translations. Whether they were read or not is a great question, and we'll talk about that later. Also, translations from Hebrew. There are a few translations of Israeli literature that are published in the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union breaks diplomatic relations with Israel after the Six-Day War. So in the early 60s, you have a number of translations of Israeli prose and poetry that were incredibly significant and treasured and valued by the Soviet Jewish reader. How do I classify these books? We can think about the books that were marginal, right? That would be accessible only in certain parts of the country, although that's tricky also. The books that were canonical and that you would just see across the board, thinking about various kind of social strata, thinking about books that were kind of equally valued by men and women, the books that were accessible, because I'm really primarily interested in the books that were published officially, right? I'm not thinking so much about samizdat or tamizdat, but those that were accessible to all, but also, of course, thinking about what is the relationship between those that were accessible and the non-accessible. Yeah, books for children, which were tremendously significant. Yeah, and kind of fit into all of these various categories. And of course, books for adults, books that were thematically Jewish, explicitly Jewish, and the books where you had this hidden meaning. Yeah, the cult books. Yeah, and this is where maybe we'll talk about the sci-fi books by the Strugatsky brothers and others that were really kind of this cult literature, absolutely worshipped by their readers, and the books that deal with the Holocaust, although that term was not used in the Soviet Union, occupy a very prominent place Jewish bookshelf for obvious reasons, keeping in mind that for a great majority of Soviet history, Holocaust was excluded from official historiography, obfuscated, and yet there were a number of books that addressed it. And finally, again, thinking about sort of the methodology and the theoretical piece, the idea of multi-directional memory, Michael Rothberg's idea that is familiar to probably some of you or many of you, is very, very important to me. In other words, how, particularly thinking about trauma and how different experiences of trauma, different narratives of trauma, different workings of memory intersect. And in the Soviet context, it is all over the board, where the trauma of Gulag, Stalinist camps, is refracted through the memory of the Holocaust, and vice versa, right? And so again, thinking about these intersections and these different kind of pathways of memory that run in these different directions is best seen through the books that I'm thinking about, and how all of that again resulted in certain reading strategies. Maybe just I'm thinking about time. Let's skip that. Maybe we'll come back to Kafka. But for now, maybe let's skip that. So let's talk about this. So I begin with Leon Feuchtwanger, or as he was known, Leon Feuchtwanger in the Russian kind of pronunciation. Major German Jewish historical novelist, right? Becomes incredibly popular in the 1920s and on. Very much a man of the left, who in 1937 comes to the Soviet Union, has an hour-long conversation with Stalin, a fascinating conversation. I discussed that in the book. Then ends up in the United States after leaving Germany when the Nazis come to power. So Feuchtwanger's novels, right, these lengthy historical novels, be it Jude Zeus, right, Jude Zeus about the court Jew in 18th century Germanic lands, or his trilogy about Josephus, the ancient historian, right, thanks to whom we know so much about the destruction of the Jewish state under the Romans, or his novel The Spanish Ballads about the medieval Spanish period, or his novels that deal with the coming of the Nazis to power, were the primary source from which Soviet Jews derived Jewish knowledge, but also the very idea of what it means to be a Jew. Yeah. So Feuchtwanger was published beautifully in beautiful translations in the Soviet Union. Collected writings of his were published in the 1960s, because again, he was very much man of the left, and venerated as a classic. And it's so interesting that while what's so interesting about the Jewishness in the Soviet context, it's not the anti-Semitism, although clearly it existed, and there were so many hurdles that Soviet Jews needed to overcome on a daily basis. But what is even more important than that is that there did not exist a public space for expressing one's Jewishness. And I'm not talking about religion, because that's a separate matter. Yeah, Judaism, just like all other religions in the Soviet Union, was essentially destroyed and then sort of allowed to exist in a corner. So I'm not talking about religion. I am talking about just any expression of Jewishness in whatever way, cultural, ethnic, right? The very word Jew in the Soviet context, when said out loud, was an absolute anathema, right? And would either provoke laughter, or would provoke hate, essentially, So while that is the general atmosphere, here you have Feuchtwanger's novels, which are explicitly Jewish, that are published in these hundreds of thousands of print runs. What is also fascinating about how these novels were published is that they would come with an appendix at the very end, which would contain commentary on everything that was mentioned in these novels, from things that had to do with ancient Judaism, the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, rabbinic writings, anything, right? So imagine when you go through the entire secondary school education or higher your higher education, and not once would there be anything mentioned about Jews. Not once. Yeah. Where do you come? And you look at these older histories of Soviet Jews that were written during the Cold War by American scholars, Israeli scholars, and they say, well, of course, Jews of silence. How could they know anything? Where could they have gotten any information from? What those scholars completely overlook is Feuchtwanger. Yeah, is Feuchtwanger. And, I provide this example, and I know that this example really is sort of, if not universal, that speaks to so many, as I discovered throughout my research, is something my mother said to me, again, when I was probably 13, 14. She picked a volume of Feuchtwanger from our bookshelf, gave it to me, and said, you have to read it to understand what it means to be a Jew. Yeah. We'll come back. Yeah, we want to talk more about Feuchtwanger and Stalin. It's fascinating, and how I think Feuchtwanger absolutely understood his importance to Soviet Jews. But this is a quotation that comes from my colleague and friend Maxim Schreier, who writes in his autobiography, Leaving Russia, a Jewish Story. He says, we were enthusiastic readers of historical fiction, from Sir Walter Scott and Prosper Mérimée to Vasily Yan, Heinrich Mann, and Leon Feuchtwanger, whose novel, The Spanish Ballad, we both read not as fiction, but as a true story of Jewish pride and valor, right? And this idea of experiential reading, right? This idea of reading these books as a pride of passage, right, was absolutely something that cut across the boards through all of these decades of Soviet history. Now we come to what I call the core of the bookshelf, the core of the bookcase, and these are the books that were written in Russian. Yeah, so we're talking about fiction. Some of these books, as we'll see, were written by major writers, some by more minor ones, and I call it the salvage fragments. And I borrow this idea from Sheila Yellen and her wonderful book called Salvage Poetics, where she shows how ethnography and translations of Yiddish literature really shaped the American Jewish consciousness during the post-Holocaust period. Yeah, here I switch it from salvage poetics to salvage fragments, because of course in the Soviet Jewish case we can only talk about fragments, these different pieces that these readers needed to piece together in order to produce their own understanding of themselves. Yeah, and this was a typical Soviet apartment with the bookcase. Yeah, begin with the classics, right? With the classics. Then I found this. I like this picture of Pushkin as a religious Jew. Yeah, in his kind of Hasidic garb. But reading the classics, your Gogol, your Tolstoy, your Dostoevsky, Turgenev, Pushkin, Lermontov, and here we're, in the wake of Russia's war against Ukraine, right? We're rightfully having conversations about decolonizing the study of Russian literature, or better term, kind of de-imperializing, right? But I think for Soviet Jewish readers, they've been going through that process all along, right? Because these volumes that were beloved, that were valued, that you were taught from young age, yeah, but there were all these obstacles that you had to overcome. Yeah, and one example that I provide, reading, for instance, Pushkin's Captain's Daughter, and coming to that passage where the soldiers are kind of officers hanging out, and they're saying, we don't have much to do because we can't just go out and create a pogrom every time, or just beat the Jews every time, right? So you come to that passage, and of course the word that would be used most likely in the 19th century text would be what is derogatory term now, Žid, right? And you stop. Right? And the effect would be different for different people. Some would sort of brush it aside. For some, it would lead an indelible mark that would make them kind of go in a different direction. Yeah, but that stays with you, right? So in other words, that kind of work of whatever you want to call it, decolonization, de-imperialization, but understanding that for those writers, the idea that there will be Jewish readers of their works reading them in Russian was quite bizarre. Yeah, and for some, quite an anathema. Again, we think about somebody like Dostoevsky. Yeah, but now we come to the real core, and really the canon, right? So here are the writers that played such an enormous role. Ilya Ehrenburg, yeah, major writer, poet, journalist, somebody who really saw himself as a core Jew in a sense, right? A Jew who was that intermediary between the Jewish community and the government. Ehrenburg writes his memoirs during the thaw. He is the one who comes up with this term, the thaw, right after Stalin's death, his memoirs, Люди, годы, жизнь, people, years, life, that were filled with all of these Jewish fragments and details that were absolutely a revelation for the Jewish readers, yeah, to see these Jewish fragments in this vacuum where nothing else existed. On top, we have Vasily Grossman, who was mentioned today. Michelle mentioned him in the context of the film Commissar. What's really important for me in this book is to try to see how these books were read from within their time. In other words, the readers of Grossman in the 1950s, 1960s did not know the Grossman that we know today, the author of Life and Fate, or the author of Everything Flows, yeah? And yet they did read some of his works, for instance, his travelogue to Armenia, which contained really interesting Holocaust fragments. In other words, they did not know sort of the magnitude of this writer, yeah. But again, they were able to piece out these fragments that played such an important role in forming their identity. This, of course, I think familiar to most of you, Isaac Babel. One of the very, very few Soviet writers, Russian Jewish writers, kind of entered the canon of wider Jewish literature, killed by Stalin, whose works are published again during the thaw, end of the 1950s and on, yeah? Explicitly Jewish stories, either about the Odessan gangsters or about the Civil War period. And again, it's interesting to think how those were read. Or Ilf and Petrov, right? The authors from the duology, the Golden Calf and the 12 Chairs, published in the late 1920s, 1930s, that become these cult books for the third generation and on, yeah? Interestingly, those books were definitely perceived as Jewish by many, many readers, except that in this case, reading between the lines for the majority did not work. Because to be able to read those books between the lines, you really needed to have some esoteric knowledge, which most of those readers did not. Yeah, and this is a lot of these writers like Ilf and Petrov, Babel, they form what I call the Odessan terrain, right? And Odessa was one of the very, very few places in the Soviet Union that was sort of could officially be seen in some sense as a Jewish space, right? Odessa, the port on the Black Sea. I compare the importance of Odessa in Soviet Jewish culture and history to the importance of Lower East Side for the American Jewish one, right? That space that remains Jewish even after most of Jews left. Let's go on. Yeah, let's go on. Sorry, this lack of time. Yeah, let's move on. Children's literature, yeah? And these were the books that, again, in this rites of passage that stayed with you. And I'll just give you two examples. One is by Lev Kasil, tremendously popular children's writer. He was already popular during the Stalinist period and on. So he writes this sort of autobiography called Conduit и Швамбрание, where he talks about him and his brother creating this magical kingdom in their childhood. And there's a passage in the book which works like a code with Soviet Jewish readers, and it's a passage where the brothers talk to each other, and the younger brothers discovers that their family is Jewish, right? And he just can't absolutely kind of grasp that. So, what do you mean we're Jewish? And this is all taking place in pre-revolutionary Russia, and so they go on Jewish, and then finally he asks, "Is our cat a Jew too?" Right? And that was, as I said, kind of that Jewish code language that spoke to so many of Soviet Jewish experiences, kind of similar to my own experience, because I think when I was probably 6 or 7, I had that discovery as well, having thought prior to that we were Russian. Yeah, I came home because I was probably called a Yid at school, and I came home and I asked my parents, "What do you mean, we're Jews?" And they say yes, and they had to bring out their Soviet passports, where of course it was, the infamous fifth line where it said, Jew or Jewish, right? So using those works that dealt with pre-revolutionary Jewish experience was how the Soviet Jews got at their own understanding of their identity. And I'll mention this other book by a female author, Alexandra Brustein, the book Дорога уходит вдаль, The Road Kind of Runs Ahead, which describes the author's childhood in Lithuania, before the revolution, right? And again, it was one of these kind of cult books that spoke to so many, especially girls, yeah, and again touched kind of at the core of identity. How many more minutes do I have? Okay, let's move on. Okay, the Holocaust corpus, and again, I'll just mention, I hope we can explore it during the Q&A. The Diary of Anne Frank is published for the first time in Russian in 1960 with a preface by Ilya Ehrenburg. It was really kind of under Ehrenburg's achievement, yeah, to do that. This is his preface. This is from his preface, yeah? Let's read this. Everyone knows that the Hitlerites, he's using the Soviet language, Hitlerites, not Germans, Hitlerites, murdered 6 million Jews, the citizens of 20 countries, rich and poor, the famous and the unknown. The atom bomb fell in Hiroshima suddenly. It was impossible to take cover. For several years, the Hitlerites organized raids on millions of people like the hunters chasing wolves. Jews tried to disappear by hiding in pits and abandoned mines in the crevices of cities. It's tough to read these lines after the events of Saturday. The parallels are pretty horrendous, yes? 6 million were asphyxiated in gas chambers, shot in ravines or in forts, condemned to a slow death from hunger. One voice speaks for these 6 million. It's not the voice of a wise man or a poet, but of an ordinary young girl. Yeah? Just a few sentences, but look what Ehrenburg is doing here. He's packing the entire Holocaust history within these few sentences. Yeah? He's using the Soviet language. He talks about Hitlerites. Yeah, he's making it more universal by comparing to Hiroshima, and yet it is a text that speaks explicitly to the Jewish experience during the war and the uniqueness of Jewish faith, Jewish faith during the war. And you should try to appreciate and imagine what that meant to hold that book, yeah, and to read those lines, all published officially. And there's some really interesting parallels between what Ehrenburg says and the review by Meyer Levine of the first publication of the Diary of Anne Frank in the New York Times, where he says exactly the same thing, that this 6 million speak with the voice of one girl. Yeah, so there's some really interesting parallels. Another example that I give, a book that must be translated into every language, has not been done yet, and it's a book by Masha Rolnikaite, and her diary, although it was not really a diary, yeah, but her recollections about her time in the Vilna ghetto during the war. Rolnikaite was first, he originally wrote it in Yiddish. It was published first in the Lithuanian translation, then in the Yiddish translation, and finally came out in the Russian translation with the help of Ehrenburg in the 1960s. Right, a tremendously significant and powerful book that again so explicitly talks about the Holocaust. Yes, censors intervened, some stuff was taken out, but the core remained. And here, this is a great example of these parallels and intersections that I talked about. Look at the cover, right, where you do have the barbed wire, kind of this Holocaust imagery, but then you look at the inside, right, and this typical socialist realist illustrations. Yeah, so there is nothing that sort of screams Jews at all here. And yet that's what the book is all about. And it shows how that negotiating was done between the official and unofficial poles in these different other contexts. I'm not going to read this passage, but this is one of the very, very few books, book by Anatoly Rybakov, Heavy Sand, Тяжелый песок, published in the late 1970s, a book that was absolutely cult and that was read by everybody. Yeah, one of the very, very few books that spoke specifically to the contemporaneous Soviet Jewish experience, not the pre-revolutionary, right, but to the Jews of today. There was something that the Soviets did allowed on very, very rare occasions, and Rybakov was able to do that. Yeah, the book that again was translated into English, and by the way, beloved by Elie Wiesel. We have a wonderful, wonderful review of it. Obviously, and I'm just touching, yeah, sort of, but again, with the Q&A, hopefully we can go into more. There were, of course, the poets, and kind of my first love as a scholar. But here we have some poets, the Michel Boris-Slutsky, yeah, we have Lipkin, here, who was Grossman's friend, and Avsei Dries, wrote in Yiddish, but he was primarily known through his translation of his children's poetry into Russian, read by millions. But of course, the Jewish readers would have a special connection. Okay, let me mention two more cases, and then we'll stop and open up to Q&A. I'd love to talk about Trifonov, but no, let's go to. So the sci-fi. So this is kind of something unusual, right? So far, we've talked about sort of the explicitly Jewish books, yeah? But sci-fi, and now I'm writing a book about Jewishness and the Holocaust in Soviet and East European science fiction, where I've discovered so much more. The Strugatskys are just the beginning. Yeah, there were so many more and so much more. But the Strugatsky brothers, these legendary cult Soviet sci-fi authors from the early 1960s and on. Some of their works were officially published, some were not. Yeah, essentially most of their works are these pretty clear allegories about the Soviet condition, yeah, and the Soviet regime, although wrapped in a pretty sophisticated kind of philosophical framework. But their novels are filled with Jewish fragments, Jewish elements, from allegories of the Holocaust to Judaism, Kabbalah, just kind of explorations of Jewish faith, etc., etc., etc. Let me just give you one example, and then I'll stop. Yeah, and that's the next. So this comes from their first serious work, published in 1962, Escape Attempt, Попытка к бегству, where we have, it takes place in the 22nd century, where we have, it's a perfect communist society, and we have a couple of guys who travel to another planet and take with them this person who is looking for a planet because he needs a refuge. His name is Saul, yeah? And what we discover by the end that he, in fact, comes from the 20th century, from the Nazi concentration camp, yeah? And the society that they discover on that other planet, well, you'll see what this society looks like. Let me just give you these two quotations. This was a dark misery, an anguish and complete hopelessness. Here you felt an indifferent despair when no one hopes for anything, when a man falling down knows that no one will help him, when ahead there is absolutely nothing but death, alone in an apathetic crowd, right? The language is redolent of that Holocaust imagery. Read Primo Levi, yeah? And you'll see these enormous parallels. And then the door opened out with a creak, and out of the darkness fell a completely naked, stick-thin man. Vadim bent over him. It was a corpse, stiff. Vadim caught sight of dozens of twisted bodies clinging to one another, interlaced thin naked legs with huge feet, wizened face distorted by harsh shadows, gaping mouth. The people were sleeping on the bare earth, and one on top of the other. Yes, an unmistakably Holocaust picture. Was so interesting, and again, thinking about all these intersections, that originally the Strugatskys had the Gulag camps in mind. But the censor said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's only so far kind of the thought politics could go, right? And so they went in the direction of the Holocaust using the language of World War II, which was permissible, right? But in between, you have Gulag, and in between, of course, speaking specifically to the Jewish readers about the Holocaust, that was kind of this vacuum, as I said, in the official Soviet historiography. And then it goes on and on and on in fascinating ways. And there were so many more who did similar things in also probably more interesting ways. Yeah. So I'm going to stop here, right? But there are other layers which we can touch on during Q&A. How was scripture read? How was it accessible? What about, did there exist any knowledge about Judaism? The books about Israel, the books about Zionism or anti-Zionist literature, what role did that play? And so many more. Yeah. So I'm sorry I have to stop, or not sorry, but thank you. And please, I'd love to hear questions and comments.
How were they are on display for everybody to see, so I'm imagining that it's also a code word for togetherness or connection, how were they talked about, or were they not talked about?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think, again, if you think about, right, visible signs of Jewishness, right? So clearly there are no religious signs. There are no mezuzot, there are no menorahs. There is nothing. Maybe some would have hidden, somewhere deep, right? And so these books would be the only visible sign, right? And for a lot of people, once you walk into somebody's apartment, either as a guest or a friend, right, the first thing you go to the bookcase, right, and you just kind of start checking it out. And if you see certain books, and networks were formed, unofficial networks, word of mouth, keeping in mind that Soviet society is where everything needs to be hunted for. Nothing is readily available, right? So to get books, you could get them, subscribe to them, to the collected works, for instance, through your work, right? Or get them at the black market. But or again, if you lived in capital, stand in line, for hours on end to get that book, right? And so that's how kind of that word of mouth worked, right? Or I remember, when Master and Margarita, Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, which in some sense fits into this because of the scriptural content and remember, when it was finally published, still in the magazine journal form, my grandmother got it for a night, right? So you have it for a night and you read it, and then you pass it on, right? And that's of course how kind of in authoritarian societies these things spread. But absolutely, books were that visible sign, were that's kind of that signal that we speak the same language.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk.
Thanks,
I would like to ask you to return to the material culture with which you began, and particularly to the materiality of the bookshelf.
Yes.
And what struck me the most is how different your bookshelf, the bookshelf itself, is from the bookshelf you in your picture from when you were 12.
Yeah.
The red bookshelf, in contrast to the heavy wood from which the Soviet bookshelf was made. And probably brown, right? Because brown is such a practical color.
Right.
Could you talk about the bookshelf itself in this context, please?
Could we go back to that picture? Yeah, it's just the very big, it's like the third picture. Yeah, what's interesting about that is that the bookcase or the bookshelves were such a central and integral part of the overall apartment ambience, right? So that, in fact, and I've heard these stories, and this comes from not the most kind of intellectual sort of, families, I guess, but the books, because again, it was something that people would hunt for, and because you had to have a certain book, right? Because it was this treasure for some for intellectual reasons, but for others, just like you would have a certain pair of jeans, right? You had to have a certain book on your bookshelf, and some would actually match like the color of the binds of the books with the wallpaper, right? And the bookcases, I think, if I remember, sort of the furniture set that we had in our apartment was called Trimbita. And I think it was either from Moldavia or from somewhere else. So it also depended on your sort of status and what kind of furniture you could get, because again, nothing was just, if you looked, for instance, so this is in my parents' apartment. Yeah, if you looked at the bookcase in my grandparents' apartment, it would have looked much sort of more impoverished in look, not in content, but in looked. Red, no, red, sure, yeah. I mean, some of those kind of colors, but depending on the wood that was used. Yeah, I mean, I have it. I think it was reddish. Yeah, but maybe that's kind of the former Soviet citizens. I think it's called Trimbita, no? Yes, Feuchtwanger, right? Feuchtwanger, the reddish volumes. Yes. Yeah, the volumes, right? But you're talking about the actual. Yeah. Yeah. I think it depended on what you could get and what kind of connections your parents had, and how much they paid extra for getting that furniture set.
A little bit different kind of question. I'm interested, after Stalin's death, what the dialogue, if you want to call it that, would have been between the Israeli literature that was coming out and the Russian literature, both because of the emigres and the commerce that happened between the literature in the 50s and later. And of course, we have many very distinguished Israeli authors these days. But I wondered how that relationship developed.
So you're talking about the relation between Hebrew writers and so could we go forward? More. Still more. A little more. And a little more. More. Okay. After this one. And one more. Okay. Right. So so as on the one hand, when the state of Israel was declared, the Soviet Union supported it because they kind of Stalin, was thinking that it would be a forepost for Soviet power in the Middle East. Didn't quite work out, and already, quickly by 1953, the relations really deteriorate. Then they improve again, and there are some cultural relations between the two countries. And of course, the Israelis are working hard on getting the Soviet Jews out, and also trying to get some literature and materials for them. What is also interesting, and I think that's what you're referring to, is of course there's so many major Hebrew Israeli writers come from the Russian background, right? Kind of the classics, the classic writers of Hebrew literature grew up with Russian literature, were great translators of Russian literature into Hebrew. So I'll give you one example. So this is one of these collections of Israeli literature that was published in the early 60s. Probably the most interesting volume called Poety Israela, The Poets of Israel. It was edited by Boris Slutsky, this major poet on the Soviet side. On the Israeli side, it was edited and really put together by Alexander Penn. A really, really interesting poet, also comes from the Soviet Union. His first language is Russian, becomes a Hebrew poet, and very closely affiliated with the Communist Party, goes to the Soviet Union a number of times. He kind of sees himself as a bridge between the two countries. What's interesting about this volume is that, yes, there are some poets who are included for kind of political propagandist purposes, but a great majority are the major poets of Israeli poetry of that time. Interestingly, it also includes, probably for political reasons, but it includes translations of those poets who wrote in Yiddish, as well as the Arab poets in Israel. Those who wrote in Arabic, and so there are these very interesting kind of connections. Of course, all of that breaks after the Six-Day War, and so books like these would be completely expunged from library circulation. They were inaccessible, and those who did have them, and they were published in small print runs, so primarily people in the capitals would be able to get a hold of them. But if you had that book, so that would be hidden incredibly deep within your bookcase, right? Because if this was discovered, you would be in a whole lot of trouble. And there are other interests. There's a collection of Israeli prose that published around the same time. And so the relations between Yiddish and Hebrew is also very, very interesting.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I will return us to material culture with my question. I just moved over the weekend, and I was really forced to face the reality that books are very hard to move.
Yes.
And that my bookshelf is one that I just didn't want to move. And this made me think about the fact that the Soviet Jew as an archetype today kind of exists all over the world, right? And it exists in diaspora. I grew up in New York in the 90s with my core friend group being populated by people who identified as Soviet Jews but had emigrated with their families around 1990,
Yes.
but still had this identification very strong
Right.
as Soviet Jews,
Right.
which still seemed to be based on this idea of a kind of common lexicon, a common set of cultural references. So my question is, how did the bookshelf survive in movement? And you can even choose to answer this personally, because clearly something happened between that 12-year-old sitting in front of this large, heavy
Just a little bit,
bookcase
yeah.
and that red bookshelf today. Like, how did how does the bookshelf kind of transform or exist in diaspora?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. On the one hand, I would say, and this is where I think this idea of excavating a civilization works. In other words, it's a civilization that's gone, right? Despite the fact that, as I said, certainly Soviet Jewish actors are among us, right? And also on the world stage, but this culture that existed, this civilization that existed, is essentially over. I think my generation is probably the last generation that can still relate to it, yeah? Obviously, I relate in a more profound fashion because of what I do as a scholar, yeah? But more universally, right? There's still these fragments that really speak. After that, it is very hard. I dedicated this book to my two kids, and I said the inheritors of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, but they are only symbolically, unless they will, decide at some point. In other words, it's a civilization that's over, that needs to be excavated. Yeah, and now you find these books in so many garbage dumps in Israel. In the United States, people just throw them out. Yeah. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, a more positive side of the story is literature written by former Soviet Jews. For instance, in the United States, yeah, there's a whole cohort of writers, yeah, who come from that heritage, yeah, now write in English and have become very prominent writers, kind of impacting the broader literary life in this country. It's problematic, and I'll give you one example. But also in Israel, in Israel, it's very, very interesting. While on the one hand, the Soviet Jewish community is enormous, yeah, and Soviet Jews have transformed Israel in so many ways. But there exists this huge rift between the Soviet Jewish community and the creativity in Russian that continues, and the Israeli literary and intellectual scene. There are some bridges that are being built, but there are so few of them, right? But if you look, for instance, at the Aliyah, the immigration of the 1970s, the really Zionist immigration, yeah, of the 1970s from the Soviet Union to Israel, and the writers and poets that emerged from that generation, yeah, they grew up with those books, and those books had such a huge impact on their own writing. The problem is that, again, that writing is not being translated into Hebrew, yeah, and we'll see whether it will be interesting to add to the subsequent readers, yeah. But to return, could we go back to, it's like the penultimate image. Right, so this comes from Gary Steingart, very prominent writer, right? And it comes from his autobiography, Little Failure, came out a few years, probably 6 years ago or so now. Yeah, and he provides this, example in his book. He talks about his parents and his parents' bookcase in Queens, New York. Yeah, and he says, so he sees a Siddur, a Jewish prayer book, right? A Siddur enclosed in a plastic case and coated with fake silver and fake emeralds. It is written in a language none of us understands, but it is so holy that it blocks out the Pushkin that my parents have all but committed to memory. Yeah, and my commentary, Steingart refuses to imagine that his parents, in fact, treasured that prayer book, even if they could not read it. In his view, the garish tome is a false idol decorated with cheap stones that obstructs the true deity, Pushkin. He chooses to bypass the sites of Soviet Jewish cultural memory that would contradict his portrayal of Soviet Jewishness as nothing but trauma and reactionary politics. He hollows out Jewishness and with it the contents of the Soviet Jewish bookshelf. Many have disagreed with this reading of Steingart, and he's a very, very talented writer. But I think that's exactly what he does, right? That is kind of a lot of these writers, filmmakers who come from the Soviet Jewish kind of lineage refuse to appreciate the richness, the Jewish richness that was at the heart of it. Yeah, there is a TV series that just came out in Israel called Sovietska about this, 20-year-old something young woman whose family came from Soviet Union in the early 90s. Yeah, she was actually born in Israel, and she's sort of just Israeli. And yet there is this Russian side, and that's what the TV series explores for the first time in the history of Israeli television. And it's sort of authentic and good. But what's interesting is that all of this stuff is absent. Yeah, the picture of Soviet Jews that it presents is that essentially, yes, there was absolutely nothing Jewish there. Yeah, they're proud of their kind of Russian cultural heritage and their Russian language and sort of feel out of place in the Israeli society. But all of this is absent. So I think it really kind of, the Soviet Jewish artists, filmmakers, writers need to take that step back and revisit and appreciate the richness that was there. One writer I think who does that well is David Bezmosgis, who's in Toronto, Canada. He does it better. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
I'm really sorry. It's kind of a small question. I just wanted to ask how Kafka figures in the Soviet Jewish bookshelf, because when you look at Kafka as a writer himself, the fragmentary aspect is really present there, because it's like it was never published. Most of the works we have access to. So what works are present of Kafka in this bookshelf? And
yes,
yeah, just
sorry, great question, thank you. And it really again shows how again, the books that were important for Soviet Jews were also important for the culture at large, right? So Kafka's writings are published for the first time in mid-1960s in the Soviet Union. I think I have a picture. It's like the third image. There's a hefty volume that comes out that includes everything but the castle. So it includes the trial, it includes all the major short stories. And yeah, that's the volume. Yeah, 1965. And there's a preface written by an important scholar, Suchkov. And what Suchkov says in that preface, he talks about Kafka, and then he says that Kafka was Jewish, right? And he says that belonging, right, as a Jew meant so much to him, right? And that single sentence, right, that Kafka, this writer that everybody was fascinated with, and that for so many among Soviet intelligentsia embodied the Soviet experience. Kind of, there was this saying, right, that we were born to make Kafka a reality, right? This absurdity of Kafka is exactly what the Soviet life is all about. Suchkov says, not only that Kafka was a Jew, but that really mattered to him, right? And again, if you put yourself in the mind of that Soviet Jewish kind of member of intelligentsia, you can see sort of how much that means. And also, really interestingly, if you look at the studies of Kafka published in the Soviet Union, 1970s by the scholar Zatonsky, for instance, it explicitly talks about Kafka's Jewishness. Yeah, it references the works published in the West that talks about Kafka's Jewishness, right? It sort of says, was he kind of a Jewish prophet? Yeah, so kind of, it interestingly also how censorship worked. Yeah, what can be said in what context, right? With this writer, you know, Austro-Hungary, yeah, you can talk about his Jewishness. When it came to the Russian writers, that's a different story.
I've been asked to allow one more question from an Israeli visitor here. I'm going to give in.
Thank you very much. And sorry for my English, and thank you very, very much. I was asking myself what about the scientific writers, Jewish, and I think especially about Freud, for example, all the psychoanalysts, and there were in this bookcase of Jewish Union.
Not so much, right? I mean, Freud, if you know, to learn something about Freud, you had to go to these, you know, very censored Soviet textbooks and studies that would discuss it. Yeah. So where that's similar, again, if we had time, we could look at the books written within the field of scientific atheism, научный atheism, right? They talked about Judaism as of this horrible religion, just like any other religion. But in fact, those books, at least some of those books, were written between the lines, right? Those books try to get some information out to the reader, right? But that's how so many of, for instance, works about Western philosophy in the Soviet Union. That's how you had to read them, right? To get through all this propagandist language, including, Freud, yeah, to get at some information, right? And really, really between the lines, yeah. And you had to do that. Yeah.
Thank our speaker one more time for wonderful.
Thank you. Great questions.